a Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello everyone, welcome to Living History, and my guest this week is someone who's been on the podcast before. In fact, had one of the most popular interviews we ever did on the podcast. It's Vietnam veteran Gary McKay, and he's going to talk to us today about what it means to veterans going back to Vietnam and that sometimes difficult process of going back and confronting their wartime experience. So Gary, thank you so much for joining us again on the show.
Not a problem, mate.
Gary, tell us about your experience after the war. Did you, as you know, when you returned to Australia after you'd been wounded in 1971 and you came back and had a life in Australia, was Vietnam something that loomed large in your life in those years after the war?
Oh, definitely, because like many veterans, I went through a fairly traumatic time. Apart from being wounded and spending about a year in hospital, there was a terrible apathy that had swept across Australia, and by that stage I had been offered a permanent commission, so the army was now my new life, and I felt somewhat betrayed by the public, who were throwing crap on veterans for their service in Vietnam when they really should have been throwing crap on the politicians. Did you see a lot of that firsthand, Gary? Oh, yeah. At one stage, my platoon was reacted to a demonstration at University of Queensland. And so the platoon, as part of a rifle company, deployed out there to provide security for the university regiment, the Queensland University Regiment compound and its vehicles, which were under threat. We weren't issued live rounds, I might add. We carried our weapons, but we were not issued live rounds. It was all more for show than anything else. And a high percentage of the soldiers in the platoon hadn't been to Vietnam. Most of the NCOs had, and most of the officers had, but it was, there was a verbal abuse and threats and all that sort of stuff, but we shrugged it off because we knew that if they had come across the wire, they were going to get a fair hiding because we weren't feeling really happy about it all. It was a bad time. At one stage, we were banned from wearing uniform on public transport, as if we had something to be ashamed of. It wasn't good.
How did you find that transition? Well, you didn't transition back to civilian life because you stayed in the army, but how did you find the transition back to peacetime? How did you find trying to get on with your life with a wife and young family as a recent veteran of the conflict?
I was pretty lucky in that I was posted to the Jungle Training Centre, and we were going flat out. We were still training guys to go to Vietnam as part of the Embassy Guard, but by the time the end of 1973 came around, and Gough Whitlam got elected, that basically all went down the drain. And that was one of the hardest things I had to do, was to tell guys that they would not be going on the Embassy Guard to Saigon. I think I was lucky because we were fairly busy. And then the end of 1974 came around, and I'd been promoted to captain, and then to 6RR. And so then Cyclone Tracy came along, and bang, we were into that. And that was good for the Army's morale, because we had a real job to do. We were appreciated by the people of Darwin in helping put their lives back together and providing assistance to the civil community. So it was very busy. And then the next thing I knew, I was posted off to Rifle Company Butterworth on security duties for 6 months. So I think I was lucky in that I was kept busy. I'm glad I wasn't just doing normal training jobs, because that might have been a bit tough. But I was lucky in that I was kept busy. The moratorium movement by the end of 73, beginning of 74, basically died out because everyone had withdrawn from South Vietnam. The Americans and all the Allies had withdrawn, and the conflict in Vietnam had now reverted to what it was originally, which was a civil war, and that continued until the 30th of May 1975.
Given the way the war ended, I mean, it was a bit of a slow burn as well. I mean, it wasn't a surprise to anyone. What was the feeling like as a wounded combat veteran who'd lost mates and who'd given everything you could over there in Vietnam? How was that wind down in those years when it was obvious that we were just packing up and going home?
Well, before we deployed, they decided that they'd only have a 2-battalion task force in Nui Dat. And we were warned, beginning of 1971, that we would probably not get a full tour in. And we knew that we were not going to be staying. There was no way, even if you just watched the television reports without doing any other analysis, that this was a winnable war. And very early on, my sergeant and I decided that our main mission when we went to Vietnam was to bring as many people back alive as we could without shirking our duty. And that was it. When we were told, when we were in Vietnam in August, September, that we would be pulling out of Nui Dat by December and coming home, with the exception of my rifle company that stayed there as the Thin Red Line until March 1972, we felt we had betrayed our South Vietnamese comrades. It was a terrible feeling. It left an awful taste in your mouth. We felt like we were abandoning these people to their fate, and we knew without the Allied support, they were never going to win. There was no way. So we felt a sense of betrayal there, I guess. When I was in hospital, I remember I just had my second lot of surgery, and I was sitting in my hospital bed, I'm watching my TV and watching Bob Hawke walk up the steps of the Sydney Town Hall with a North Vietnamese trade union delegation, and I felt really strange about that. And I thought, which is probably one of the reasons I've never voted Labor ever since. But, I just felt pretty awful about that. Then, when I got out of hospital and back to work, and we watched the sad saga of South Vietnam being overrun, I don't think any soldier wants to be on a losing side, but as far as we were concerned, the only thing we got out of it as Australian veterans was we were never defeated on the field of battle, and by 1971 we actually owned Phuoc Tuy province. We dominated it, and so we hadn't lost our little war, but on a larger scale, of course, the Allies had been forced to withdraw, if not more for a military reason than for political.
You said that you felt like you'd betrayed, or that we as allies were betraying the South Vietnamese. By this stage of the war, we'd lost more than 500 blokes killed. I mean, what were the feelings of the blokes who were currently serving in Vietnam about the sacrifice that had been made by all those blokes before them, and now the whole thing was coming to an end?
No, a terrible feeling. It was like, well, what was this for? Why was it worth it? Why did we get there in the first place? And of course, it took many years for the truth to finally come out about our involvement in South Vietnam. We felt pretty ordinary. But the thing is, you can't navel gaze. You're out on patrol. You've got to stay alert. You know, the enemy are not going to give you a free pass. So you had to get on with your job.
Tell me, Gary, about life after the war was over, maybe in the 80s, back in Australia. Was Vietnam an experience that defined you? Did you find that your life after the war was just intangibly changed because of what you'd been through in Vietnam?
Oh, definitely. Having been in combat, having experienced all sorts of combat, from fleeting contacts to ambushes to heavy battle, some with armour and some without. The whole raft of skills that you pick up or you hone whilst you are in a combat zone is incredible. It just becomes second nature to you, of course, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to go into training organisations when I came back, was that it was invaluable in passing on those lessons to the next generation of soldiers coming through.
What about on a personal level? Were you suffering from any stress-related issues to do with your service in Vietnam?
No. I think because I was in the green machine, I really felt I could see it happening to soldiers who had been national servicemen, especially, who had been conscripted, trained, went to the war, came back, and then no debriefing, just turfed out and sent back home with very little support. And of course, it was going to take another 10 years before people realised that what a lot of these veterans were feeling was post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't have that. Well, I don't think I had it. I must admit, I used to go off my lolly a bit at people who cut me off in the car park, but I didn't get hit with PTSD until 2004 when I was on tour in Vietnam, and I'd gone up to Fire Support Base Coral and Balmoral with a friend of mine, Gary Adams, and we were helping the local People's District Committee find a mass grave on one of the perimeter areas in front of where one RAR had fought. And there were about 41 bodies in this mass grave. And we were trying to help the locals out by identifying the grid reference and where they thought that grave would be. Because Fire Support Base Coral was now a working rubber plantation, so it wasn't an easy task. Anyway, long story cut short, the local paramilitary policeman, who did not like Caucasians of any flavour, came down and checked our paperwork and threw us in jail for the day at gunpoint because our permits were given out of Hanoi and they were slightly incorrect. We'd been to Fire Support Base Coral, not a problem. Then we went to Balmoral, but as soon as we entered Balmoral, we were arrested and thrown in jail. When I came back home from that event, I started having nightmares and went and saw my GP, who referred me to the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service that then was, and then they sent me to Dr. Bob, the psychiatrist, and Dr. Bob came up with the technical term for my condition. He said, "You're fucked in the head." And I queried that, and I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You've got post-traumatic stress disorder." I said, "No, I haven't. I'm a Bronze Anzac. I'm a Military Cross winner. I'm too tough for that." And he said, "Well, answer all these questions." And then at the end of it, he said, "Mate, you've got PTSD. And because you weren't in control of the situation in Vietnam when you got thrown in jail, when you came back, that triggered a response. And that's what you've been having 14 days of nightmares." And yeah, I was going through a tough time. But after half a dozen sessions with Dr. Bob and then doing some psychology work with a local counsellor, within a couple of months I built a bridge and got over it. But that was the only time it happened. Was after that, the trigger was being thrown in jail. but I'd seen other guys go through worse.
Mate, I'm not surprised that was a trigger. It sounds like a pretty traumatic time for you.
Especially when the kid that was pushing me and prodding me in the back of an AK-47, he had his finger on the trigger. He didn't have it on the trigger guard, and I was more scared of being shot by this kid through bad weapon handling than anything else. And it wasn't good.
It would have been a great irony to say I've already been shot by one of those before. I don't want to see it happening again in peacetime.
Yeah.
Mate, when did you start thinking about actually returning to Vietnam and visiting the former battlefield?
Well, I'd written my autobiography, In Good Company, and because it was such a huge success, the publisher said, well, write another book. And so I decided to do an oral history. And it was only going to be Army, but then I realised that was not going to work. So I did Army, Navy, Air Force and civilians who went to Vietnam as well. And that went well. And then I was, at that stage, a half colonel, and I was on tour with the Australian Staff College up in Gladstone, and I got a phone call from one of the senior historians at the Australian War Memorial, and he said, have you thought about applying for a research grant? And sure enough, I was awarded a John Trelaw research grant, and that allowed me to return to Vietnam, because they said, what would you do if you got it? And I said, well, I would study Vietnamese language, and then I would go back to Vietnam because I'd like to interview the enemy and find out what they thought of us as soldiers, because this thought had been going around in my mind to do something on my rifle company. And the end product of that was I wrote a book called Lt-Col. There are a couple of drawbacks to that. One, I'm profoundly deaf in one ear as a result of my service in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese language is a tonal language with 7 tones. And the other thing was my instructor at the School of Modern Languages was North Vietnamese. And so I was speaking Vietnamese in the south with a North Vietnamese dialect, which didn't go down too well. So I had a few obstacles to overcome in my research. But so I went back and did Lt-Col, and so that in 1994 was my first trip back, and I was still serving in the Army, and I had to get all sorts of letters of the introduction and stuff like that. But I went back, and this guy had told me that he was a tour guide. So I went with him and found out he wasn't a tour guide's backside. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. When I get out of all of this, out of the Army, I'm going to go and be a tour guide in Vietnam, as not full time, but in between whatever else I'm going to do in life, because I know I could do a better job than this clown. And so that's what I did.
Well, I want to talk to you more about that in a few minutes, but just tell us about that first trip back to Vietnam. What was it like? I assume, did you fly into Saigon or Hanoi? I mean, what was it like when you were back in Vietnam for the first time since the war?
Yeah, so it's 1994. The embargo's still going. And we landed at Ton Son, no air bridges, and the reception area was a hangar. No aircon, no nothing. And it was heavily guarded with Army, who were in the same field dress as I'd seen when I was in combat in September 1971 against the North Vietnamese Army. They had pith helmets on, chest webbing, carrying AK-47s and wearing green canvas jungle boots. So it was a bit of a flashback. When I presented my visa and passport, I then had a bloke he must have been a graduate from the Maxwell Smart School of Spies, because he followed me everywhere I went, but he was not supposed to be seen. But we caught him on film several times with a group, and I But I was with 18 guys from my rifle company, and for all of us, it was our first time back. And, it was different, but we had a strong group that were touring. There were a couple of wives that come along. My former company commander was with me and his son. And so, when we saw something dicky going on, we just tightened up and looked out for each other's backs.
Well, Gary, you've been back to Vietnam dozens of times, and I had the privilege of travelling over there with you for the 50th anniversary of Long Tan. You've taken a lot of veterans back to Vietnam. What's your feeling about the importance of those veterans returning? Is it important, if you've served in the war in Vietnam, to go back and walk the ground? Is it just a nice thing to do? What's your advice to veterans who are thinking about going back?
Oh, yeah. Look, some guys have told me I'll never step foot in Vietnam again. Even the local treasurer from my sub-branch down here in Kiama, he was at the Battle of Long Tan, and Potholes said, I'll never go back. Anyway, one day I was at morning tea with him, and I was talking, and he said, this mate of mine did a tour with you before. And I said, yeah. He said, I think I'll go back. And I took him back last year, and he loved it. I've had over 200 veterans return with me, and I can say with my hand on my heart that not one of them has regretted it. Sure, some of them had some very emotional times while they were in country, but they got the support from either their mates or their partners that they were travelling with. They get it from me, of course, because I can see when it's coming on. And when I am on tour, I try to get veterans involved to tell their stories to our tour groups. So they don't just get to hear my experience of war. Well, and as a personal thing, I also get them to tell their story. And for many of them, it's the first time they've really spoken to other people about it. It's a fairly emotional time for them, because when you're on operations in Vietnam and someone gets killed, there is no normal grieving process, so they don't get to do it. Even when they come back from the bush after an operation, it's a remote procedure. You just don't get to do it properly, to grieve for your mates. So when they're back in Vietnam and they go back to the battlefields, and that all of a sudden it wells up, and then it's the time for grieving. And especially when we go to the Long Tan Memorial Cross at the battle site, and we have our small service there, it means a lot. And the guys finally get some closure when they do that. I think it's good for them.
One of the things that I've most enjoyed about operating tours to Vietnam is seeing that on most tours we have a mix of veterans and civilians, and I think that works really well. You know, we have younger people who have no experience of military service, let alone the Vietnam War, and we have veterans there who went through that combat, and I think that works really, really well. There was a couple of times when we did our tour in 2016 where, you know, the coming together of people who had this respect for the veterans but no understanding of what they'd been through, and then the veterans wanting to tell their stories. It was really quite remarkable, especially standing on the ground where it all occurred. Do you find that when you go on these tours?
Oh, absolutely. On the last tour I did, I had two guys who just come back from Afghanistan, and they were commandos, and all of their military experience has been in open country. And when I took them up to Cu Chi, and I started walking through the bush, and then I got people to go and stand 10 metres off the track, and they just disappear into the background. I looked at these two commandos, and they're looking at each other and going, this is different. And you could see them starting to appreciate the sort of combat, the jungle fighting that we had to do. It's really good to see that. And it's also really good if we can get people from the Army, Navy and Air Force all there as well. We've been lucky enough to have helicopter pilots on tours and guys who've been air crewmen, guys who've flown caribous and all sorts of things. And on one tour, we had a guy who'd flown out of Fan Rang with the Canberra Bombers, and he had no idea of the ground war. And he gave so much in what his war was like, and then he learnt so much from us. It was terrific.
When we were over there, I noted that at one stage we ran into a group of North Vietnamese veterans, and there was a lot of camaraderie between the Aussie veterans and the North Vietnamese. It wasn't something we'd set up. We just bumped into them in the Reunification Palace, and there was a lot of handshaking and backslapping, as I recall. How important is that reconciliation with a former enemy?
Well, ever since the very first time I went back, it has been, it has really been an eye-opener. It's the thing about it, and that was what I found when I went back and did my book Delta 4 with the research grant. I was sitting down with a guy who was the district chief in a place called Long Dien, and he'd been in 274 Viet Cong Main Force Regiment, and I had fought against this mob on several occasions. And I was welcomed into the office, and because I wanted to interview this man, and it was just overwhelming, this sort of hospitality. And I said to him, I said, I'm finding this really remarkable that there is no animosity, no anger, no angst against the Australian veterans. And he said, there are 4 reasons. And I said, what are they? And he said, the Australians, you buried our dead, you took care of our wounded, you tried to do something for the people of Phuoc Tuy province with your winning hearts and minds thing, with med caps and dent caps and putting windmills in and all, building roads and bridges. He said, and you did not commit atrocities. And they had a lot of respect for the Australian soldier. And when, you might remember at the Presidential Palace, one of them asked our tour guide, our local guide, who we were, and he said New York, which is Whoop Dai Loy, which is, these are Australian soldiers. You could see their faces, they all changed, and it was all shaking hands and so on and so forth. That's a common reaction whenever I run into people who have been on the other side of the rifle. It's because of our reputation as soldiers in Vietnam.
That's obviously as a distinction from US troops, are you suggesting there?
Definitely from South Vietnamese and Republic of Korea. I really cannot speak for the Americans because I haven't watched that interchange. The Americans that I ran into up in Da Nang, who were on a tour, were all from a air cav unit. They're all chopper pilots or crewmen. And they really did not mix, from what I could see. They didn't go out. They really just stayed in a very tight group. I didn't see too much of that at all.
What would your advice be, Gary, to any veterans who are listening to this now and who are thinking about doing their own trip back to Vietnam?
As I tell anyone who's thinking of going, go to the local library and get a copy of the book I wrote, which was designed for veterans. It's called Going Back. And it was my publishers, Allen and Unwin, because I'd done so many books with them, they gave me a bit of latitude to do a niche book. And Going Back Many people have commented to me that they were so glad that they read that book, because it's about, when I actually took a case study of guys, I interviewed them before they went, interviewed them while they're in country, and then 3 months afterwards. And they became a case study. They're all 5 RAR people. And it's not me telling them how good it is to go there. It's their words telling other veterans what they've experienced. And people, they get a lot out of that, and they realise it's not going to be the bogeyman that they think it might be. They might actually find that it was an enjoyable experience. And I've had many veterans say to me, many veterans, at the end of the tour, I've said, well, what do you think of that? What do you think of Vietnam? They said, geez, isn't it great to see the fact that they've picked themselves up and moved on from that terrible conflict which tore their country apart for so long. And, you know, and just the way they've gone ahead. You know, one thing about the Vietnamese people, they don't look behind. They don't forget, but they don't look behind. They look forward. And they certainly have gone forward.
Well, it's a wonderful country. I mean, I've been to Vietnam several times now, and it's one of my favourite places to go. The people are wonderful. The food, the culture, the landscape is spectacular, and of course that wonderful military history that's there. And it was a real privilege, Gary, to be over there with you the time that we did it, and I'm looking forward to getting back over there again with you, mate, to walk the ground. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing these experiences. I know a lot of them are very personal for you and perhaps difficult for you to talk about, so I really appreciate you coming on and just sharing your thoughts today.
Oh, no problem, Matt.